$380 million. That's the kind of number that makes your ears ring and your stomach do a slow, nauseous somersault, but it's also the exact value of the illegal empire sitting on my family's dirt while I was back in Ohio scrubbing grease off carburetors just to keep my electricity from being shut off. For 15 years, this HOA president lived like a Roman empress on land she didn't own, collecting every cent of rent from nearly 900 homes, all while my grandfather Ezra died in a drafty cabin thinking he'd failed us. And it all came to a head the day she marched onto my porch in $500 heels to call me, mountain trash, for parking my work truck on my own inheritance. She had no idea she was standing on a gold mine that belonged to a mechanic with nothing left to lose, and she definitely didn't in Oppos. To know that inside a rusted floor safe lay a single 1952 contract with a hidden clause that was about to turn her luxury kingdom into my personal parking lot. You ever feel like the universe just enjoys watching you struggle, like you and Oppos? Re the lead actor in a cosmic comedy where every punchline involved a past due bill? That was me, 3 days after Grandpa Ezra passed, maxing out my last credit card just to afford the gas for a 12-hour drive from the Rust Belt to the Colorado Peaks to settle in a state I figured was worth about as much as a scrap metal pile. My family had been, mountain poor, for generations, the kind of poor where you hear stories about how your ancestors traded a fortune for worthless rocks and pine trees, and my dad always said Ezra was the king of bad investments, a man who bought 1,300 acres of elk trails instead of something practical like a suburb in Denver. When I finally pulled up to that old cabin, the air was so thin it felt like breathing through a straw, but the smell, man, it was pure nostalgia, a mix of old cedar, motor oil, and that faint metallic scent of a wood stove that hadn't in Oppos been lit in a week. I was standing there, dust motes dancing in the sunlight, looking at his coffee mug still sitting on the table next to a pair of folded reading glasses, thinking I'd just sell the place for funeral costs and maybe have enough left over for a steak dinner on the way home. But then I heard it, the distinct rhythmic click-clack-click of expensive shoes hitting my gravel driveway like a warning shot. I stepped onto the porch, wiping grease from my knuckles with a rag. And there she was, Brenda St. Clair, the kind of woman who looks like she was born in a country club and wooed in Oppos. Tino, a hard day in Oppos. That's work if it hit her in the face. She had the oversized sunglasses, the perfectly bleached hair, and a Range Rover idling behind her that cost more than the house I grew up in. And before I could even say hello, she was waving a clipboard at me like it was a holy scepter. I don't know who you think you are, but this eyesore is a violation of community standards, she said, her voice dripping with a fake, posh accent that made my skin crawl as she pointed at my dented F-150. I just blinked at her, still holding a funeral brochure, and managed a quiet, mind Oppos. This is my grandfather in Oppos, Islan, but she just scoffed, a sound so sharp it could have cut glass. Honey, your grandfather was a squatter we tolerated out of pity, but now that he's gone, the Blackwood Heights HOA is cleaning house. So get that trashy truck off my mountain before I have the sheriff haul you and your junk to the county line. White trash, I felt my face heat up, that slow burn anger that starts in your chest and works its way to your jaw, but I didn't in Oppos. TL, I just watched her strut back to her car, scribbling a $500 a day fine on a yellow slip of paper and tucking it under my wiper. What she didn't in Oppos, T realize, what nobody in that valley realized, was that Brenda wasn't in Oppos. T just my neighbor. Her husband, Arthur, was the county auditor, and for 15 years, they'd been running a game that would make a mob boss blush. They had convinced the entire development that my grandfather's land was, common HOA ground, collecting millions in lease fees and dues while my grandpa lived on Social Security, thinking he'd lost his rights in a legal battle back in the 90s that, as it turns out, never actually happened. The next morning, I was woken up by the strobe light of a sheriff's cruiser and Brenda standing in my yard with 2 deputies, looking like she was directing a Broadway play, claiming I'd, threatened her with a weapon, the day before. One of the deputies, a guy named Miller who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, pulled me aside and whispered, Look, kid, Brenda's husband pulls the strings at the courthouse, and if they want you gone, You're gone. Just sell the place and walk away before they find a reason to lock you up." End quote. I realized right then that I wasn't into oppos. Just fighting an annoying neighbor. I was fighting a machine that had been eating my family's legacy for breakfast. So I spent the next 48 hours buried in the library and the county archives, digging through records that smelled like damp basements and forgotten history. That's when I met Martha, a librarian who'd lived in the valley since the 50s and remembered my grandfather when he was the lead surveyor for the whole territory. And when I told her what Brenda was doing, her eyes turned into twin Flintstones. She pulled out a dusty file of property assessments, and we saw it. In 2010, the value of Ezra's 1,300 acres had been, in quote, manually adjusted, in quote, by Arthur's office from $4 million down to practically nothing, a move designed to make the taxes disappear, while the HOA built nearly 900 McMansions right on top of her dirt. End quote. "This is a land grab, Cole," end quote. Martha whispered, end quote, "and they've been using the HOA as a laundromat for the money," end quote. But the real kicker came when I finally cracked that old floor safe under the kitchen linoleum, my hands shaking as I pulled out a leather-bound folio that hadn't into oppos. Seen the light of day in decades. Inside was the original 1952 master lease, the one Grandpa signed when he allowed the first few cabins to be built on the ridge, and right there on page 12, in a tiny font that looked like ants crawling across the paper, was the reversion clause. It stated, in plain, undeniable English, that the lease was and quote, privilege granted upon the continuous and lawful payment of ground rent, end quote, and if those payments were, end quote, interrupted, diverted, or falsified for a period exceeding 60 consecutive days, end quote, all improvements, buildings, and structures on the land would immediately and irrevocably revert to the ownership of the Brennan family. I sat on that dusty floor for an hour, the math spinning in my head like a slot machine. 847 homes, each worth an average of $400 grand. That in oppos. That's over $380 million in real estate that, because Brenda had been, in quote, diverting, in quote, the lease payments in her own private account for 15 years, now belonged to me. I wasn't oppos, just the owner of a cabin anymore. I was the landlord of an entire town, and the people living in those houses didn't in oppos, even though they were technically squatting in homes that I now owned lock, stock, and barrel. I didn't in oppos, run to the cops, because the cops were Brenda and oppos as friends, and I didn't in oppos, run to the press yet either, because I wanted to see how far she'd go. So I hired a heavy-hitter lawyer from Denver named Silas who looked like he ate HOA president for lunch. We filed a, in quote, quiet title, in quote, action, an illegal move that basically forces everyone to put their cards on the table. And within hours, the valley went into a total meltdown. Brenda tried one last desperate play, showing up at my door at midnight with a suitcase that smelled like cedar and expensive leather, offering me a, in quote, settlement, in quote, of $200,000 to just sign a quick claim deed and vanish. She stood there on my porch, her eyes darting around the dark woods, her voice trembling as she said, and quote, take the money, Cole. You and oppos. Rhea Mechanic, you and oppos. I'll never see this much cash again. Just sign it and go back to Ohio before something unfortunate happens to this old cabin, end quote. I just leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms, and said, end quote, Brenda, I and oppos. V spent my whole life fixing things people like you broke, and I think it's finally time I fix my grandfather's estate. But thanks for the offer, it'll look great in the discovery phase of a lawsuit, end quote. The look on her face was better than any lottery win, a mix of pure, unadulterated terror and the realization that the, end quote, white trash, end quote, she tried to bully was holding the keys to her front door. A week later, we held a town hall meeting in the community center, and the tension in that room was so thick you could have carved it with a knife. Almost 1,000 people packed into a space designed for half that, news cameras lined up at the back, and Brenda sitting in the front row with a team of lawyers who looked like they were preparing for a funeral. I walked up to that podium, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I didn't in oppos talk about money first. I talked about my grandfather, Ezra, a man who worked until his hands were cracked and bleeding, a man who loved this mountain and was treated like a leper by the people living on his land. I projected the 1952 contract onto the big screen, the reversion clause highlighted in bright red, and you could hear a pin drop as the reality sank in for 847 families. They had been paying dues to a criminal enterprise while their homes sat on land they didn't and oppose. To have a legal right to occupy anymore. End quote. I'm not here to take your homes, end quote. I told the crowd, and I could feel the collective breath of 1,000 people release at once, end quote. But the Blackwood Heights HOA is finished, and as of this morning, Brenda St. Clair and her husband are being served with federal warrants for wire fraud and money laundering, end quote. Brenda jumped up, screaming that I was a liar, that she'd built this community. But then Silas, my lawyer, played the clincher, a recording from the night she came to my porch, where she clearly admitted to, end quote, diverting, end quote, the funds and tried to bribe me to stay quiet. The silence that followed was deafening, and as the FBI agents I'd been working with for 3 days stepped out from the back of the room to cuff her, the crowd didn't end oppose. Cheer. They just watched as the woman who had dictated the color of their shutters for a decade was led away in plastic zip ties. I ended up offering every legitimate family in that subdivision a deal that sounded too good to be true. They could buy their lot from me for a flat $50,000 fee, paid over 10 years at 0 interest, which was about 80% less than the land was actually worth. I wasn't in oppos, teeing it to be a billionaire. I just wanted my family in oppos. Name cleared and a little bit of justice for a man who died thinking he was a failure. And as for the 400 acres of untouched forest, I turned that into a permanent wilderness preserve in Ezra's name, ensuring that no one, quote, Karen, end quote, with a clipboard would ever be able to put a fence around it again. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. While 846 families were grateful and moved on, there was one group of Brenda's diehard supporters who filed a countersue, claiming that my grandfather's, end quote, lack of enforcement, end quote, over 15 years meant I'd forfeited the land through adverse possession. They're still fighting me in court, trying to prove that being a, end quote, nice guy, end quote, and not evicting people immediately makes you a weak owner who doesn't in oppos. Deserve his inheritance. And it makes me wonder, in a world where the loudest person usually wins, is there really such a thing as, end quote, fair, end quote, justice, or did I just trade one headache for an even bigger legal nightmare? I'm curious to know what you guys think. If you found out your entire neighborhood was built on a lie and you held the power to evict every person who'd ever looked down on you, would you have taken the, end quote, nuclear option, end quote, and cleared the mountain? Or would you have done what I did and tried to build something better out of the wreckage? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I was too soft on them or if Brenda got exactly what she deserved. And hey, if you in oppos, you got an HOA story that makes mine look like a bedtime story, I want to hear that too. So hit that subscribe button and let into oppos. Let's keep holding these tiny tyrants accountable.